a number of years ago, at the same time my book, Men and Women of the Corporation, was published, I published a little policy book called Work and Family in the United States, in which I argued that it was time to bust the myth of separate worlds, that work and family were totally separate worlds, that institutions which had once been joined had been divided by the Industrial Revolution, and we had to understand them together. And so I wondered, what has changed? What still needs to be done? And so I want to talk to you about 4 challenges in busting the divide, because change is never linear. Change always involves going backwards as well as going forward toward a state where both workplaces and families can thrive, where you have an economy that also produces economic well-being for its citizens. And this seems especially important today when the demographic revolution means that an aging population is not being replaced by the number of births. And depending on one's political leanings, there are many points of view about how that gap could be bridged. But in fact, there are countries, the Nordic countries in particular, where they're bridging the gap by treating both with a great deal of respect. I've just returned from Iceland, where I spoke to many people, the women leaders of Iceland. Iceland is a country that punches far above its weight, one of the smallest countries in the world, and yet one of the highest happiness scores in the world. And the US has been dropping in happiness below the top 20 countries. And gender equity, gender equality is the norm, and so is having children. So if you want to do something about the demographic challenge, you need lots of children, but you also need women in the workforce. So they're growing their population, and the First Lady of Iceland, Eliza Reid, who is Canadian, just wrote a book in which she talks about how easy it was to have babies. It was just natural. There was a room in every workplace where if you needed to, you brought your baby, and it was just natural. And she said because of that, she had more babies and a flourishing career, and now is First Lady, although her husband is not running for re-election. So what has changed? And are we actually moving on a linear path, or are we moving backwards? And are we just in the middle of change? So 4 challenges. One has to do with individuals and families. The second has to do with employers and workplaces. The third with communities, institutions, and society. And the fourth with the change process itself. So first, individuals. We have to reframe the narratives, and we have to look at the rationale for talking about work and family in the same breath. And that rationale is not what we often think. I mean, we often frame the issue as a women's issue, even though we know it's not an issue. In fact, Frank Dobbins and his collaborators research about what policies help bring more equality, equity, promotions in big companies, found that it had nothing to do with specific policies. It had to do with the culture, but it also affected men more than women, particularly low-income men from minority backgrounds. So we have to reframe it. First of all, it's not a women's issue, but to the extent it's a women's issue, it turns out that having more women in top positions, having more women who are economically empowered, is also good for families. We know from my colleague Kathleen McGinn's work that working mothers are good for daughters. You know, they raise children who also feel a sense of entitlement. Or other colleagues of mine, including other winners of the award nicely named after me, talk about the fact that when you have positions of economic power, you're more entitled to ask for more. And you're more entitled to ask for that on behalf of other people. And that's really important, because in all the years since I first wrote that policy book, the household division of labor has barely budged. Although I think it would be great if AI can do more chores, but it's barely budged. And so, as Arlie Hochschild had said, there's a second shift. Women do more of the household work, including the care for children. And when I spoke at a conference recently on what men could do for women's leadership, which was supposedly a discussion of allyship, my answer when I had the chance to talk to what men can do for women's leadership is the laundry. I think that women do fine if given the opportunity and freed of chores. So we need to reframe the issues because otherwise we're in danger of stereotypes holding back women's empowerment. Mexico just elected a woman president. In fact, the two candidates were both women. And so what happened? It reminded me of all the tokenism studies I had done, was that the press immediately said, because she had a mentor who helped her get her position, that was she just going to be a puppet? It was like, are women always in the shadow of men? Can they stand on their own? So we need to reframe many of our narratives to create an Aretha Franklin world, RESPECT, where every individual is seen in terms of their own talents, and that is what the Dobbin studies show, that it's culture in organizations, not leave policies, not hiring policies, not bureaucracy. It's the culture of respect toward every person, creating an environment for teams. So the second thing is, what about employers? What about workplaces? Well, I think employers do what they can inside their boundaries. My new book is called Think Outside the Building, about big change outside of the structures we currently have. Most employers are confined to those policies that exist within their buildings that they control, but that's not where many of the issues are. I call this the Cory Booker problem. Cory Booker is the senator from New Jersey. He is the son of two rising executives at IBM, black executives. And IBM's policy within its building were very egalitarian, provided opportunity. And so his parents rose through the ranks. Well, except that they couldn't buy a house in New Jersey. Because of policies of redlining, black people couldn't live in certain neighborhoods. What did IBM's equal opportunity policies within the building do about that? The answer was very little. They ended up having a white person appear to buy their house, and then they had fair housing claims and so forth. But many of the issues that prevent people from rising, that prevent families from thriving, are well outside the building. And the things that the policies we talk about, like family leave, et cetera, can't help. And we do know that if you take advantage of those policies, sometimes it doesn't make a difference. There have been so many studies about the motherhood policy, the daddy benefit bonus. Those are very important studies. They tell us something, that you can't make change just by a policy here and there, a policy at a time. So we have to be thinking more broadly. The third challenge has to do with reinventing communities and society, because I think for working families or for individuals, one of the things that will benefit them the most are changes in, transportation, infrastructure. I think bus shelters are a work and family issue. I think that the quality of infrastructure, we have to reinvent cities, because the people who least can afford to stay out of the workplace. I mean, many of the things that we've been doing are good for elite women or elite families, but not necessarily for the less affluent. And so we have to reinvent cities. We have to think about things like buses. I love buses. I love public transportation. I don't use it enough, but I love it. And in fact, one of the things that I think is really a work and family issue are electric school buses, because they're good for children's health. They're not breathing those diesel fumes. They are good for the school systems that save money. They educate the students. And so we have to be thinking much more broadly about society and how we tackle big issues like climate change and children's health in the same breath that we think about the workplace and we think about the advancement of certain kinds of people and we think about family well-being and what creates flourishing children. And the fourth challenge then is the change process. How do we get there? And here's my view of change. We all know the African proverb, it takes a village. It takes a village to raise a child. I say it doesn't take a village. It takes a cross-sector, multi-stakeholder coalition. Now, I realize that doesn't roll off the tongue. Not easy to say, but that's what it takes. We do not make big change or systems change either within the building or by helping some individuals cope, making it easier for them to cope on a daily basis. We make big change because we work across institutions, across sectors, with people representing all the big stakeholders as well as the grassroots working together. And in those places, I've been studying US cities and teach 140 people, rising leaders from 14 US cities next week. And in studying the differences between those cities that are better able to make big change have many things in common, including a common narrative across institutions, a common story, something they get people to value, a feeling that we're all in it together. There's less racial separation, although there's still some of that nearly everywhere. There is more of a sense of the issue is important. People talk about it. And finally, there are bridges or connectors from organization to organization. And so in order to make change, the school systems work with large companies, work with entrepreneurs and the sources of capital, work with the nonprofits, work with the faith-based organizations in coalitions toward a goal. And that goal can be the well-being of families, because that's the well-being of children, that's the next generation, that's the only way that we're going to have a workforce. And to work on such long-term issues requires multi-stakeholder coalitions, and it requires a view that there is a long term to think about in which we're all in it together. But I don't think we're there yet. I think we're in the middle. And so I want to leave you with what I call Kanter's law. It may not be as good as a Kanter's award, but Kanter's law says everything can look like a failure in the middle. If we give up because the negative forces are too big and we don't know what to do with them, by definition, it's a failure. If we regroup, build new coalitions, reframe the narratives, think outside all of our buildings, we have a great shot at making significant change and making the US a little more like Iceland, which might mean a little cooler now in this heat wave. Thank you.